so good morning, everyone. So thank you for joining us for the launch of this joint report on carbon pricing in the power sector, role and design for transitioning towards net carbon development. So some more people are joining us, I guess, from the former session. So the one information before, at 11 o'clock, we'll have a fire alarm test. So don't be afraid, just to let you know, we don't need to leave the room, but just to inform you ahead of time so nobody gets surprised, okay? So this is a joint report because it's co-prepared by the International Energy Agency, IEA, by the International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP, and by the World Bank. So why this report? As you know, many developing countries are now taking commitments to move towards a lower carbon development path, even to net zero for some of them. And the power sector is one of the largest emitters, okay? So naturally, they are thinking about, can the carbon pricing help decarbonize my power sector? And as you know, you have heard in this event many times, but the power sector has been included in carbon pricing instruments in different places of the world, but most of the time this experience has been implemented in advanced economies. And there are some, but still very limited experience of implementing carbon pricing in the power sector in the developing world. So we identified a kind of a gap there. So it's the reason why we decided these three institutions to join efforts, and to join efforts on both sides of the aisle, I would say, of two worlds, the carbon pricing experts and the power sector experts, because it's complicated. So it's the reason why we have the International Energy Agency, but we also have ICAP. And in the World Bank, we're also working together, the climate change group, with my colleague and co-author, Ariku Margade, which is here, and myself, I'm sitting in the energy department. I'm working a lot with the power sector. Okay, and actually these two worlds are so represented in the panel by practitioners on the two worlds also. So we have Dr. Lei Zhu, who is from the Ministry of Environment in China, and we're actually working on the National Emission Trading Scheme in China. And we have Gina Downs, who is working at ESCOM, the power utility of South Africa, on implementing for ESCOM all the consequences of the carbon tax in South Africa. But enough for an introduction, and let me try to quickly introduce and unpack this report. Actually, I will be playing a kind of double role in this session. I will be at the same time moderator and quickly presenting this report, because we didn't want to have too many World Bank people on the stage. So it's the reason why I'm doing this two words at the same time. So I will be quickly unpacking this report. So first, the first thing to say is actually the power sector is complex and it's diverse. All over the world, there are different types of power sector structure and so on. So for that reason, introducing carbon pricing in the power sector is also complex and diverse. And to navigate this complexity, this report is structured around this core concept of the value chain. Why so? Because actually the emissions from the power sector results from a series of decisions taken by a series of stakeholders all along the value chain. So what are we talking about? So the value chain of the power sector is start with the generation stage, with generators making decisions of investing in new power plants and retiring them possibly. And we have the system operator, we decide on dispatching these plants or not. And then we have the distributors, we decide to purchase on the wholesale market electricity from different generators, coal producer or renewable energy producers. And then finally, we have the consumers. We decide to consume electricity at different times of the day, or to invest in energy efficiency, or even to install solar rooftops. So all these decisions articulate all together and eventually result in activating power plants, and some of them are using fossil fuels and results in emissions. And of course, all this depends on the national domestic resources. Depending on the country, you have more coal or more hydro. So, and all these decisions are actually deeply influenced by the regulations of the sector along the value chain. So what are we talking about? For instance, in certain countries, you have auctions, you have PPAs, you have on-grid tariffs for the generations. For the system operators, some are adopting merit order. Some have implemented capacity mechanisms. There are load shedding management in some cases. On the distributor and retailer side, some have access to wholesale market, some do not have. You have sometimes renewable energy portfolio, natural monopoly regulations, tariff regulations. And for consumer, they have or not access to demand response mechanism, net metering for distributed PV, and so on and so on. And all that depends, of course, of the structure of the sector. It's different world if you are a vertically state-owned enterprise, or if you have a single buyer model with power generation run by private, or if you have fully liberalized sector. And all these decisions are also influenced by the specific challenge faced by low-income countries or middle countries. Like, for instance, access to finance for investing in generation, insufficient capacity to be dispatched, cost recovery issues from the utilities, and affordability or rapid growth of the demand side. But the thing is actually that carbon pricing can also influence all these decisions at each stage of the value chain. And this is the bedrock foundation of this methodological framework that this report is providing to start guiding the practitioners on how to design and understand how carbon pricing can eventually influence the decisions to move these decisions towards a lower carbon development path. So let's look at now what does it mean. So the report tracks 4 possible outcomes of direct carbon pricing along the value chain. So at the generation stage, it can help shift toward lower carbon generation capacities. So this is investment. So this is a long-term impact. On the dispatch stage, it can help shift toward lower carbon plants, shifting from coal to renewable in instant moments. So it's a short-term impact. On the distribution, it can help the distributor to choose to purchase more from renewable producers than from coal producers. And it can then lead to renewable energy producers to become bankable, to go to the bank and invest in renewable energy. So it can be also a long-term impact. And on the consumption side, same thing. They can make decisions to shift the moment they are consuming, invest in long-term energy efficiency measures or renewable auto generation. And to achieve that, you can apply the carbon pricing at different regulation points along the value chain. You can have it on the generation. So for instance, choosing to regulate the emissions of fossil generators, putting a price on carbon on this on the emission emitted by the generators, and and this is the case, for instance, of South Africa. On the dispatch stage, the system operator can decide to put a price, a cost on the carbon content of the input to the dispatch system, and this is the case of South Korea ATS. At the distribution stage, you can put a price on the carbon content of the electricity purchased, by the distributors. And this is, for instance, the example of electricity importers in the California ETS. And you can also imagine to put the carbon price at the consumption stage. It's typically scope 2 kind of carbon pricing design. And in that case, you put a price, a carbon tax or an ETS, on the carbon content of the electricity consumed. It is, for instance, the case in the 7 provincial pilots of ETS pilots in China. And actually can even have an additional regulation point, which is upstream, which is putting a carbon price on the fuel purchased by the power plants, like, for instance, in Colombia. So these are the different regulation points where you can actually consider having a CPI. And actually, you can have multiple outcomes depending on the regulation of the sector, because whatever the regulation point you choose, there might be a pass-through of this carbon pricing or not. So depending on how the power sector is organized, you can target one main irrigation point and still have benefits along the chain. On one direction, downstream, for instance, you have a carbon tax which is carried over with the tariff. You can also have upstream, because actually if you put a carbon price on the consumption side, the consumer, the large industry, can decide to sign a bilateral purchase agreement with a new renewable energy producer, who will be able to go to the bank and get his new renewable energy plant built. So then it will impact generation. So you can have actually back and forth multiple outcomes depending where you put, but again, depending on the structure and the regulation of the sector. So this report also looks at the capacity to generate new fiscal revenues from the carbon pricing. Why so? Because the recycling of these revenues can facilitate the transition. And we'll look a bit later on that too. So this report did an extensive literature review of ETS and carbon tax all over the world, and did 4 deep dive case studies in the developing world, in China, in Kazakhstan, in South Africa, in Colombia. Why these 4 countries? Because some of them are state-owned, still vertically or partially vertically integrated, and some of them are privatized, and some of them have chosen an ETS, and some of them have chosen the carbon tax. So it gives a certain diversity. It doesn't exhaust the diversity, but it gives a certain diversity. So, and then the report tried to explore all the pros and cons of both ETS and carbon tax options for 3 different sector models of the power sector: the vertically state-owned power sector utility, the single buyer model, and the fully liberalized unbundled power sector. So you can imagine that this is many impact to assess, though I will not develop all that the report has done in terms of detailing these impacts. I invite you to read the report, but I will now just present some key main messages and recommendations. So first, for ensuring a consistent and systemic role, it's important to design the carbon pricing instrument as a part of a broader sector decarbonization policy package. Why so? Because the carbon pricing will interact and overlap with other policies. Like, for instance, the fossil fuel subsidy reform, feed-in tariffs for renewable energy portfolio, energy efficiency measure, time of use, power sector reform, etc. So, second, for achieving impact, it's important to apply the CPI at the point of the value chain where it can influence the most the decision. It doesn't make sense to put a carbon price at the point where there is no response possible. If you put it on, let's say, on the generation and there is a shortage of capacity, you have to dispatch everything. So if you add a carbon price, you will just increase the cost of the electricity, whatever the price of carbon is. While if you put it on the consumer, even if it's a shortage of capacity, the consumer can decide to shift his consumption pattern, can invest in solar rooftop, in energy efficiency measures. So it's important to apply it at the point of the value chain where you can actually have a response from the targeted regulated entity. And then for maximizing the economic efficiency, it's important to facilitate the response. For instance, to facilitate access to finance, to subsidize the access to the low carbon solutions. So, and this is the way to use the recycling of the revenues to, economists will say, to increase the elasticity of the demand to the carbon price signal, okay? And finally, for the political economy, it's important to design creatively both the pricing signal, but even more the recycling component of the carbon pricing instrument to harmonize it with other development priorities, typically, for instance, affordability. So, and there are solutions for that. For instance, you can imagine to have a compensation for low-income consumers, but outside the electricity bill. So this way they still receive the signal price, the price signal, so they have an incentive to change a bit their habit of consumption, but they will receive a compensation, like for instance in California, a flat climate credit. So in terms of revenue, it will be neutral. So it will preserve the affordability priority objective, okay? And we'll stop there and now move to our panelists, and we'll start with Luca Lowray, which I think is who I think is online. So Luca, I hope you can hear us, and I will quickly introduce you. So Luca works at the International Energy Agency, and Luca is one of these energy guys who's deeply committed to mobilize forces and to help the decarbonization of the energy sector, especially the power sector. So he's leading, for instance, the joint IEA and OECD work of the climate change expert group, and he produced a number of reports on technical issues as related to the NDC's implementation and how to translate that into the energy sector. And he works for he has worked as a co-led this report for us. And Luca, my question to you would be, so the International Agency is primarily focusing on energy, correct? So could you give us a sense on how you see the role of carbon pricing among many other instruments to achieve the goal of decarbonization of the power sector? And if possible, can you highlight one or two challenges that you note for developing countries willing to implement the carbon pricing instrument?
Absolutely, happy to do so, and thank you very much, Christophe. I'm really sorry that I cannot be with you today in person, and I would like, first of all, to thank the World Bank and ICAP for the great collaboration that we had in the elaboration of this report, which was 2.5 years in the making, because as Christophe very elegantly outlined earlier, this is a very complex topic. And the report benefited from the advice of some of the top experts around the world on carbon pricing and the power sector. So let me start by tackling your first question on the role of carbon pricing in net zero. At the IEA, we see that policies and regulations are actually the primary drivers to decarbonize the power sector. And unfortunately, there is no silver bullet, so we need really a host of complementary policies to decarbonize the sector. Carbon pricing instruments, such as ETSs or carbon taxes, are among the many levers that countries have at their disposal to decarbonize the sector. But it's also fair to say that carbon pricing instruments on their own will not deliver a net zero world. However, carbon pricing instruments have a lot of benefits, as Christophe was outlining earlier, such as revenue generation, but there is also a lot of evidence about that if the carbon pricing instruments are designed properly, they can really trigger the decarbonization of the power sector. Coming to your second question on the main challenges for developing countries to implement the carbon pricing instruments, as the research of this report has unveiled, governments, especially in developing countries, face several challenges when trying to implement carbon pricing effectively. And I think the report does really well in dissecting the different challenges and suggesting some example of how other countries that have gone through this process have overcome them. Some of these, as Christophe was saying, pertain to governance, such as a lack of dedicated institutions. But I believe that one of the main challenges that still pertains and remains today in some developing countries that we are seeing the opposite of a carbon price in place, namely fossil fuel subsidies, which effectively represent a negative carbon price, or in other words, a subsidy to carbon emissions. The IEA estimated the government spent in 2023 around $620 billion to subsidize the use of fossil fuels, mostly in emerging and developing economies. And most of these subsidies were poorly targeted and disproportionately benefit higher income groups. And we know that...
Luca, yeah, I suggest you pause for a second, because as we were told, we have this fire alarm drill, which will just last for a few seconds. So we don't need to get out of the room, but just to be sure that we can hear you properly. I just sorry for that interruption. And
I was wondering what was this sound.
I hope it will stop soon. So, Luca, if you want to repeat your two last sentences or something like that, because actually we couldn't get.
No problems at all.
Sorry for that again.
You're all safe in Berlin. Now, we're saying that to me, one of the main challenges that still remain relates to fossil fuel subsidies, and that at the IEA we estimated that the last year $620 billion were spent by governments in subsidizing the use of fossil fuels. Most of these were in emerging market and developing economies, and they were not targeted to those who needed them most. So phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies is actually...
Yes, I hope it's only twice. We are perfect. Sorry again. Apologies.
No problems. I hope I'm not saying something controversial that is...
It's answered.
Is that one?
Okay. It's all recorded, you know. So okay. Sorry for that.
Something to remember. Now, and so I was saying that basically phasing out fossil fuel subsidies it's a priority in my view for emerging markets, for those emerging markets and developing economies that still have fossil fuel subsidies in place. And this was also one of the calls from in paragraph 28 of the outcomes of the first global start date at COP28. So we are very well aware that subsidies reform can be politically and socially difficult, but there are good examples of countries that managed to replace them with targeted support for vulnerable households. So for now, I'll leave it there, Christophe, and back to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So insisting on the need to combine with multiple other instruments and also to be consistent across the board, and not continue to subsidy fossil fuels on one side while trying to reduce emissions on the other side. So makes full sense to try to be consistent. Now turning to Gina. So Gina Downs, is somebody who has chosen to try to change the system from inside. She's involved with environment since the very beginning, but she's working at ESCOM, one of the largest power utilities in Africa, and also one of the largest emitters. And Gina is responsible for the engagement on climate change, developing climate change strategy at ESCOM, and also she's leading the dialogue between ESCOM and the Ministry of Environment, especially the Department for Forestry, Fishery and Environment, and also with the National Treasury, who is in charge of the carbon tax and the carbon budget. So, Gina, South Africa has implemented the carbon tax, and ESCOM is regulated under the carbon tax. So, can you tell us a bit about the challenges that you are going through, especially that at the same time as many other developing countries, South Africa is going through a power sector reform. So can you tell us a bit about this experience?
Yeah, thank you, Christophe, and thank you to the World Bank for allowing us to participate in this panel today. For those who aren't familiar with ESCOM, although I think we've probably hit a few headlines around the world, we are the state-owned entity in South Africa, supplying about 90% of South Africa's electricity. Our capacity base is 47 gigawatts. Of that, 83% is coal-fired. Most of those stations built in the 80s. And we do also have a little bit of a mix of nuclear, hydro, open-cycle gas turbines, a little bit of wind. And we purchase energy from independent power producers, 7 gigawatts last year of capacity, most of which of those are renewable energy plants. So there is always a feeling in South Africa that if ESCOM is doing well, then the country can do well economically and socially, and electricity is really a pivotal good for the economy and for for society. So as we embark on this journey towards net zero, as you say, we have also been going through a liberalization process of the electricity supply industry. As far back as 1994, with the first democratic elections, the government did say that that was their intention, and a series of legislative developments have followed. Most recently, the Electricity Regulations Amendment Bill Act was signed last month. And so in this process of both introducing independent power producers and liberalizing the market, Eskom has been working since 2019 at the direction of our shareholder to unbundle the business into generation, transmission, and distribution businesses. And the National Transmission Company of South Africa started operations 31st of March this year, which is really exciting. So what's interesting is your report talks about regulatory points along the supply chain and how in a vertically integrated entity, they're all merged. 3 of those points are merged. And now as we liberalize those kind of regulatory points, unmerge, and I think it presents some challenges and some opportunities. I think one of the big things to bear in mind then is that your carbon pricing instrument needs to be flexible, because the power sector is generally always under reform in one way or another. So even before the Electricity Regulations Amendment Bill was signed into law, the President has gradually lifted the threshold for the licensing requirements for private generation in South Africa. So already it is expected that there is something like more than 9 gigawatts of private generation in the pipeline. There's also an estimate that there's already 4.4 gigawatts of solar installed on rooftops and with businesses, largely supported by incentives as well, supplied by National Treasury. So we do have the tax and we do have some other instruments as well. So the discussion the last few days has always been about this suite of instruments, and I found that really that we are a real example of that. But I do feel that in phase 1 of our carbon tax, which was also implemented in 2019, there was recognition that there were some pre-existing taxes, which would have been a bit of double counting. So we've been allowed deductions in phase 1 of the carbon tax. And so the carbon tax has not been passed through to the customers as yet. The deductions have allowed us to avoid that. But phase 2, which starts in January 2026, the full cost of the carbon tax will be passed through. So we are still a regulated entity, although with this amendment bill, we are moving towards a multi-market model. But because our price is regulated, we are obliged to recover our costs, and we're allowed a certain rate of return on our assets. And so, an entity can't just absorb these costs and still remain a going concern, and they have to be passed through to the customer ultimately. But I think the most significant thing that's happened to us recently is we've been struggling financially. Some of that is due to non-payment from the municipalities. The municipal arrears were 58 billion rand at the end of the last financial year, as well as that regulated return on assets has been a little bit below what we requested. And so financially struggling, but also at that point, and government has come to the party with that National Treasury are incentivizing municipalities to pay their arrears on time, and they've implemented a mechanism to help the municipalities do that. And they've also had to come on board and allow a debt relief to Eskom based on very stringent operational conditions that we have to meet. That said, our operations had also declined in that time, and in our last financial year ending March 2023, we had 280 days of load shedding, which basically means every single working day that year. So you can imagine that has quite a impact on people's psyche. You get up in the morning, you can't make your coffee, you get stuck in traffic, the traffic lights aren't working. it's affected the economic production. You're not always sure, as much as we've become world class at managing this lack of capacity and this load shedding. We even have countries come to visit us to find out how to do it. It doesn't stop it being a little bit unpredictable for people. That we do our best to allow people to plan around it, but you really can't plan out of some of the higher stages of load shedding. So. And I think it's almost more been the load shedding at this point, given that the carbon tax is not passed through, that has encouraged that private generation and the rooftop solar. But what I did find really great about your report was that it did give you a way to think in terms of those value chains, about that point of incidence and what the knock-on effects would be. I also like the fact that what it brought to my mind was the fact that we are changing. So how does your carbon pricing instrument change as your structure changes? And also the highlight on case specifics, because in every country you have case specifics. So it's very difficult if another country is coming to tell you how to do things and you have certain priorities that you have to do. In South Africa, 30% of our population is living in poverty. So while you do have affluent households that may have purchased rooftop solar, you may also have rural communities or that have switched out of electricity to firewood for cooking. So that conversation about a suite of instruments being needed to limit these unintended consequences is very important. And I'll stop there, thank you, because I see I've taken more than my time.
So thank you very much, Gina. I retain that you mentioned about the flexibility of the carbon pricing instruments to accompany the evolution of the sector, and thinking about possibly evolving the regulation points. These are unpacked when the system is being unbundled. So look at where it makes it more sense to keep it and have an impact, and also thinking about the specific national circumstances regarding load shedding and affordability for some part of the population. So now moving to you, Baran. So Baran Doda is a senior carbon market expert at ICAP. Okay. What is interesting, especially about you, Baran, is that you have worked on carbon pricing and carbon market both in advanced economies and in developing countries. So, and you have worked with for many institutions, the World Maritime Commissions, United Nations, and the German government. And you hold a PhD and an MA in economics from the University of Toronto. Okay. So, my question to you is actually from your experience. So first, perhaps, what would be interesting to hear from you is why ICAP found it so important to support that report. And then you could elaborate quickly also, based on your experience, what are the key elements that differentiate challenges faced by developing countries compared to advanced countries?
Thank you very much, Christophe. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this panel and also be part of the organization that supported the development of this report, which is an excellent report, and it's much needed. Often we get questions specifically on this topic of the interaction between the power sector and carbon pricing. Earlier on, when Luca was speaking, he was speaking from the perspective of energy. He's at the International Energy Agency, and I am at the International Carbon Action Partnership. Our focus is emissions trading systems, compliance carbon markets mostly. And it is for that reason we felt it was important to contribute to this report, because we focus on compliance carbon markets and because we would like our work to have impact. Now, let me try to unpack each of those a bit. So, power sector is one of the first sectors to be regulated for emissions reductions, and it is now quite well known that carbon pricing is probably the most cost-effective way to do so in these sectors. Emissions trading system often is the instrument of choice, although South Africa has gone the way of a carbon tax, and there are many other examples as well. ICAP produces this annual report called the Status Report, and in 2024 we had this really nice infographic that looks at the various emissions trading systems that are in force around the world and which sectors they cover. There are 36 emissions trading systems that are in force, and all but 5 of them cover the power sector. This is why it's important to disentangle the interactions between power sector and compliance carbon pricing. This is one of the main reasons why we wanted to contribute to this report. For those wondering, the 5 systems that do not cover the power sector is Germany and Austria, the national systems, but the power sector is covered by the EU ETS in these countries. There is Tokyo and Saitama, small citywide systems, so power is not perhaps the main thing. Australia's safeguard mechanism doesn't cover the power sector either. There are also some emissions trading systems that are focused only on the power sector, like REGI, China National ETS, which is also we hear and are happy to hear are expanding into other sectors in the near future, hopefully as well. So power sector is an important sector, and in power sector, carbon pricing works. So this is why we were interested in this report. The final point, perhaps not big news to anyone in this room or online, is that power sector is also one of the greatest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. In 2022, 44% of fossil fuel combustion emissions came from the power sector. And most of these, about 3/4, is from coal-fired power plants. So if you want to have impact, you would like to have good carbon pricing instruments operating in these sectors to deliver emissions reductions cost effectively. And this is why we thought it was important to support this report. This is why we are so happy to see it being launched today. You also mentioned the question of the difference between developed and developing countries. Here, I think there are many challenges, some of which are coming to developed countries, but developed and developing countries, but many are unique to developing countries. Given that we're running really low on time, I'll just highlight the challenges and mention that it is therefore very important to have power sector reform and carbon pricing instruments work in conjunction, have a joint up approach to emissions reductions as well as power sector reforms. So what are those challenges? One, growth and demand. Developing countries will need to expand their capacity. Currently, there's insufficient capacity. There is a lack of access by significant portions of population. What is accessible may not be affordable. That's another important issue. And of course, the security of supply, we talked about load shedding, we talked about the building up of the green grids and the financing needs in developing countries. Many of these at a smaller scale apply in middle-income countries as well. So we need to learn from the experiences in developed countries and try to transpose these, taking into account these specific challenges. Those differences are really important and can make the difference.
Thank you so much, Baran. So very specific challenges for developing countries. And I also noted that you pointed that it's very important to disentangle the interactions between the carbon pricing and the power sector regulations, because you can sometimes have very unexpected effects, especially when you have a liberalized market. And for instance, not to detail it, but on the inframarginal rent, and I invite you to read the report to understand these technicalities that we cannot explain here today. So now moving to you, Dr. Zhu Lei. So you're a doctor from the Policy Research Center for Environment and Economy. You worked at the Ministry of Environment and Ecology of China. You have developed a major on policies on carbon markets, and you work for the Department of Climate Change, and I would say from day one on the National Energy ETS in China. So, and as you explained to us yesterday briefly, the National Energy Emission Trading Scheme in China has made the choice to concentrate on the power sector. You now have completed 2 cycles of reporting and compliance. So my question would be, based on this very rich experience and huge experience, what would be the few key lessons or advice that you would like to share with us and with other countries who intends to also design a carbon pricing instrument for their power sector?
Okay. Okay, first of all, congratulations to our research team that has finished such an informative report. And this report has a very clear logic and a very easy to understand. Provides many detailed case studies and offers significant insights to our readers. It's really an amazing report. And since China's national ETS now is the biggest carbon market in regard of coverage, and at present now we just include the power generation sector. So first, I want to share some achievements about our national ETS to you. And the first one is the market has raised the awareness of low carbon development among emitting entities. And I think it's not that easy, especially in low and middle income countries, to have this awareness. And by locating allowances, the carbon reduction goals are directly decomposed and assigned to emitting entities, designating them as the primarily responsible parties for achieving these reductions. And over the past 3 years, in China's national carbon market, over 80% of these units have dedicated personnel responsible for carbon asset management, especially integrating this responsibility into their daily production and operational activities. And always we put this to the first point. It's really difficult to have this achievement. Yeah, the second is the national ETS not only reduces carbon emissions with the power generation sector, but also lowers the costs associated with the emission reductions. Under the premise of ensuring the rapid development of the power industry and energy security, the national carbon emission intensity of coal-fired power generation in 2023 has decreased by 2.38% compared to 2018, while the carbon emission intensity of electricity generation has dropped by 8.78% compared to 2018. And furthermore, the foundation for measuring carbon emissions has been strengthened, driven by the incentives provided by the market. The national ETS has explored and established a carbon emission accounting system that aligns with China's specific conditions. And this system provides essential data support for the formulation and the release of China's annual carbon dioxide emission factors for electricity, as well as baseline carbon emission factors for regional power grids. It has also contributed to the establishment and improvement of carbon footprint management system. And with regards to suggestions, I want to raise, I think, according to the draft work plan we've just released to the public, the work plan on the allowance allocation for 2023 and 2024. The national ETS will no longer allocate allowances for indirect emissions generated by the emitting entities using purchased electricity. Emitting entities will only need to report data related to these indirect emissions. And following our report's logic, China will implement carbon pricing only at the electricity generation stage. However, electricity generation is also a highly complex issue. China has a diverse range of electric generating enterprises with significant differences in generating units efficiency. Additionally, the demand for electricity varies considerably across eastern, central, and western regions due to differences in economic development stages. There are also discrepancies in combusting efficiency between high-altitude areas in the west and the northeast and those in flat regions. Therefore, I would like to recommend that the allowance allocation plan could appropriately reflect regional differences by providing allowance compensation for increased emission resulting from such disparities. Besides, to better promote development of renewable energy, it is recommended to provide allowance rewards to units participate in thermal power peak adjustment. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lei. Joe. So a few key points as you mentioned. I mean, the importance to raise awareness and to have people trained and allocated to how to implement carbon pricing in the power sector utilities. I noted that. And also you insisted on the importance of the specific national and even regional circumstances related to, of course, the way the power sector works, but also the resources. The challenge is different if you have a province of a market which is coal-dominated or have a lot of renewable energy, and then you need to figure out how to ensure that the CPI will actually not only disincentivize the fossil fuels, but also to incentivize renewable energy. So with that, I think we have very little time for questions, so perhaps one or two questions. And I would like also to shift on the screen to see the QR code of the report, and then invite for a few questions in the room. So can we have the last one here? So then you can scan the QR code and download the report. So please, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Umid Mamadaminov. I'm Deputy Minister of Energy of Uzbekistan. As a developing country, we have a few questions. So we are going towards the net zero. We have ambitious goals, all of the countries, as Uzbekistan also. About fossil fuels, in order to ensure the grid stability, we still need them for balancing the grid, because renewable energy itself, like solar and wind, the variability, we cannot keep them going on their own. So what will be their role on the future, next 30 years, 20 years on the way fossil fuel generations? So we still need them on the grid to stabilize to ensure the stability of the grid.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so perhaps we can take another question, and perhaps just to prepare, I think Gina and Dr. Lei, you might have, based on your former presentation, have elements of response to this question on Kazakhstan. The second question, and perhaps we will have to stop there. So, and the second question.
Thank you for the opportunity. Very good and interesting panel. It's a question probably for you and on the authors of the. To what extent has the situation changed since the renewable energy is cheaper than the fossil fuels? Because in the marginal system, the gas is remunerating the total cost of electricity. And now in many countries like Spain or France, we have a duck curve in the middle of the day and disincentivizing of the renewable energy investments. But could be very perverse if we are putting more prices on the fossil fuels, this fixing the prices, and the unique rewarded are the fossil fuel companies who still maintain a small piece of work. I am not sure that the discussion about the carbon pricing in the electricity and the power sector become naive if you go to the rules and see how this is not impulsing the renewable energy development in developed countries. I'm seeing that we need to a deep dive about the perversions of the current system for marginal prices in the electricity systems when we are talking about carbon pricing and trying to shift to another.
Okay, thank you very much. So the first questions on the role of fossil fuels that will be still necessary to balance the system.
Yeah.
Gina, you want to say a word on that? Because it's really the case.
Yeah, and it's a conversation we have quite a lot in South Africa, so I appreciate the question. What we are trying to do in the shorter term is to increase the flexibility of the coal plants to respond to the greater amount of renewables on the grid. So min-gen and ramp-up times of your units is very important. And the problem is it tends to be the older your plant gets, the less responsive they are in that way. So it's going to take a little bit of, should I use the word investment in your coal generation to improve your flexibility. We also have a couple of gas projects that are under consideration for the same reason, just to provide that backup. But I do believe that as our, and the discussions we've had with our transmission system operator is that they will have a separate market for ancillary services. So, and this maybe talks to the next question as well, is a little bit that as much as carbon pricing is there to disincentivize dispatchable power in our case, the ancillary market may actually incentivize that same market. So you have to consider these other forces that are going to come into play. In the older stations that we are talking about shutting down and decommissioning, we are looking at technology to change the generators into synchronous condensers to help us with the grid stability aspects as well. So just because the emissions of the coal are not going to be there anymore, you can still find some parts of that equipment to still be useful in maintaining your grid stability going forward.
Yeah. Dr. Lei, you want to say something? So,
okay, I try to answer this question. A little bit difficult since, as we all know, fossil fuels are still continue to be our primary energy resource, and renewable energy, of course, is the future. But the development of renewable energy has to align with many conditions. In China, there are many electricity generation enterprises, and there are many grids and complex distribution system. So when we want to develop the renewable energy, we have to improve the abilities of all these relevant systems and infrastructures and so on. Of course, renewable energy is good. They are zero emission, but maybe we should have a plan when and how to develop this kind of energy. Since it's not so stable, renewable energy is not so stable, and our activities of producing are not so is not the same with the generation process of renewable energy. Thank you, that's all.
So on the second question, Luca, do you want to say a word about renewable energy becoming now cheaper and then the role of the carbon pricing? Or it's not, I can elaborate also on that, but I wanted to give you a chance to say a few words on that.
Thank you very much, Christoph. No, just very quickly, I think this is a very good point, but that's exactly what I was pointing at the very beginning of my intervention, that I think carbon pricing is not by its own a silver bullet, and we need other type of policies that really can incentivize investments, for instance, in renewable energy capacity, etc. I see also a very big role internationally of having guiding principles that all the countries have agreed at COP28 in paragraph 28 of the global stocktake. I think this is going to be very important to then decline different type of policies at the national level. But Christoph, please feel free to complement if this is if we still have time.
Yeah, thank you very much. We just had complementary amendments. Yes, renewables are becoming cheaper. This is right. But there is still a financing issue in the developing world. So if you put, for instance, a carbon pricing on the distributor or on the consumer, you create an incentive for them to sign bilateral contracts with renewable energy producers. And this is what they really need to have their project become bankable, to go to the bank and get this renewable energy investment to happen. It's not happening enough in many developing countries. So it's cheaper, yes, but the financing is needed, and so you need to create incentive for somebody willing to sign on these PPAs. And the carbon pricing can help on that, to move faster that transition. That is what, So, and I think with that, we can close that session. So thank you very much again for coming and joining us for this session. Thank you.